Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from Antiwar.com, and this is Anti-War News for Monday, August 8th, 2022. I hope everybody had a good weekend. I will catch you up on the news here. The first story at the top of Antiwar.com: China winds down unprecedented military drills near Taiwan, but tensions remain. So, the South China Morning Post reported on Sunday that China has scaled back the military drills that it held around Taiwan. As I covered last week, China's People's Liberation Army, the PLA, shut down 6 areas around Taiwan, simulating a blockade on the island. The Post report said that China hasn't formally announced an end to the drills, but that Taiwan's transport ministry told airlines to resume flights through the 6 areas that were blocked off by the PLA, indicating that the military action was over. So during the exercises, Chinese warplanes frequently crossed the median line that separates the Taiwan Strait, an unofficial barrier that the PLA typically avoids crossing. So we've seen China respect that line over the past few decades, and now they flew a lot of planes over it during these drills. We've seen them do that once in a while. We saw them do that in July when Senator Rick Scott visited Taiwan. And I think the last time they did it before that was back in 2020. But now they're going to be doing it a lot, it seems like, because of Nancy Pelosi. Remember, this is all a response to Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan. I don't think I mentioned that at the top there. And a Chinese warship came within 12 miles of Taiwan's coast. That's another barrier that China always unofficially respected. A country's territorial waters extends 12 miles off of its coast. Of course, China doesn't recognize Taiwan as a country, but it still respected that 12-mile barrier. Same thing with its airspace. But we saw these drills. A ship came within 12 miles of Taiwan's coast. And for the first time, the PLA launched missiles over the island. So analysts have predicted that these unprecedented military actions will now become routine as a consequence of Pelosi's visit. Chinese state television reported on Sunday that from now on, the PLA will conduct regular drills east of the median line on Taiwan's side of the median line. Now, tensions are expected to escalate as the U.S. is now saying that it will send more military assets into the region. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said that the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet, which is based in Japan, will send ships and planes through the Taiwan Strait in the coming weeks. The U.S. has also ordered the aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan to stay in the region and monitor Chinese drills. So now we'll see what the U.S. does, how many ships they send through the Taiwan Strait. They typically send a ship through that waterway about once a month. We see a destroyer go through there, and it angers China. But I have a feeling that they're going to try to put on a little show of force after these Chinese drills. So here we find ourselves in this cycle. The U.S. provoked this response, and now the U.S. is, saying that they have to respond to what China's doing. And also in response to Pelosi's trip, China cut off military talks with the U.S. And Beijing has reportedly not returned calls from top Pentagon leaders in the past few days. Now, this is dangerous because we've seen these officials. We saw the head of the UN. We saw the British National Security Advisor. We've seen other officials. Plenty of Russian officials have said stuff like this, that the risk of nuclear war right now is higher than it's ever been during the Cold War, which is saying a lot. And that's because there's no negotiation channels between the US and Russia. And now we're seeing less communication with China. So it's just kind of all this is just making the world a much more dangerous place. And it was very clear from the start that Pelosi's trip to Taiwan would really ratchet up tensions. And we're seeing the consequence of that. And she went ahead and did it anyway. So now this is related. This is from Connor Freeman, our friend at the Libertarian Institute. He's been helping us out with some news stories. And so this says that the White House is at odds with lawmakers over the Taiwan Policy Act. So the Taiwan Policy Act is a bill that was introduced in June by Senator Bob Menendez, a Democrat from New Jersey, who's the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina. The bill would radically change U.S. policy toward Taiwan. It would designate Taiwan as a major non-NATO ally. It would give Taiwan about $4 billion in military aid over the next few years. And it would also require economic sanctions in response to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And that would essentially scrap the strategic ambiguity that the U.S. doesn't say what it will do if China invades. They won't say if they'll intervene one way or another. Economic sanctions aren't military intervention, but that is a response. That's saying, okay, if China attacks, we're going to do this. And that's a big change. So when I first wrote about this bill, when they introduced it in June, I remember reading that the Biden administration didn't like it. They thought it went a little too far. And that's what this report from Connor is also saying. Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut, he said that the bill is being delayed. Menendez was trying to work on it. He wanted to work on it last week, but it's been delayed a little bit. And Murphy said that the White House has significant concerns, so they might revise it a little, make it a little less provocative toward China, which is what it would be. I mean, this would be huge if they pass this. This would really be going in a direction that we're not really going to be able to stop. $4.5 billion in military aid. That's a lot. But again, Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, Menendez and Graham, they're going to point to China's response to that as, oh, see, we have to support Taiwan. We have because of what all these drills that they're doing when they're a response to something that the U.S. did. And the next one, speaking of stoking tensions with China, the U.S. is going to participate in war games with the Indian military in an area of India that is less than 62 miles away from the country's disputed border with China, known as the Line of Actual Control. And now that's in the Himalayas mountain range. The drills will be held from October 18th to the 31st, and it will be the 18th iteration of annual exercises that the U.S. and India hold for high-altitude combat. The idea is to get used to fighting in the mountains up in high altitudes. The last iteration of these drills was held in October 2021 in mountains in Alaska. So now they're getting pretty close to this sensitive area with China. Now, if you remember back in June 2020, Indian and Chinese troops clashed in the Galwan Valley, which is in the Himalayas, on this line of actual control, this disputed border. And the Indian and Chinese troops in the region, they're not armed. So they were just fighting with fists and with clubs and beating each other. And it sounded like it was a pretty brutal fight. 20 Indian troops were killed, 4 Chinese soldiers were killed. And since then, China and India have been engaged in talks to reduce tensions over that border, but they've also reinforced their militaries in the area. And the U.S. has been increasing ties with India, military ties with India in recent years. They want to use India as a counter against China. After the Galwan Valley clashes, the U.S. and India signed a new military pact. And under this new pact, the U.S. can share more intelligence and satellite information with India. And U.S. military leaders have said that the agreement has enabled the U.S. to be able to help India with surveillance of the Chinese military across that disputed border, across the line of actual control. And the intelligence could also potentially be used for Indian missile strikes in the region. So we've seen this clash in 2020 between China and India. That was the biggest fight we've seen between them over that border since the 1960s. And they didn't let it, neither side had an interest in letting it escalate further. So hopefully, we don't see anything breaking out along this border anytime soon. Both sides, they have their claims and they're not backing down on them, but I don't think they want to fight over it anytime soon, at least. But still, like you see, the U.S. is setting itself up for where it could potentially be supporting a war against China on its border. With India. India is part of the Quad. It's a 4-nation group. It's the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia. And many hawks in Washington hope that the Quad is kind of a foundation for an anti-China NATO, really, an Asian NATO. But India is they're not going all in with the US. They're still, as we see, they're maintaining close ties with Russia and buying tons of Russian oil, which the US is unhappy about. But there's definitely increasing military cooperation, but they are trying to also stay more neutral than other countries. But we'll see how this develops. Okay, so the next one, we're getting into Ukraine. This is from Kyle Anzalone. He wrote this up the other day on Friday. Reuters has reported that the Biden administration is set to sign off on a $1 billion weapons package for Ukraine. The details of this package are still being worked out. It's expected to mostly be ammunition for the HIMARS, the multiple rocket launch systems, and also a missile system, surface to air missile defense system that the US has sent Ukraine. I'm sure there's going to be other stuff in it, but it would be the 18th weapons package that the US sends Ukraine since Russia invaded on February 24th. And it will mean that the US has sent Ukraine nearly $10 billion just in weapons. We've seen that Biden signed that $40 billion aid package back in May, and there was also a $13.6 billion aid package earlier in the year. A lot of that money goes to the Pentagon to pay for replenishing the weapons that it's sending Ukraine. It goes to the Pentagon to pay for troop deployments. It goes to other sorts of economic aid to Ukraine. Some of it, there's here you go. The Ukrainian government, here's $1 billion in economic aid. It's like direct assistance, they call it. They just hand it right over. But there's many different ways that they spend that $40 billion. But this is one way, and it's called Presidential Drawdown Authority. Biden authorizes this aid, and they take these weapons from U.S. military stockpiles. And there's no congressional oversight. Congress approved it by passing the Ukraine bill, but theoretically, Biden can say, yeah, I'm going to send Ukraine some F-16s, and Congress can't do anything to stop it. So that's kind of the situation that they put themselves in. The next one here, Amnesty International has come under a lot of pressure after they released a report last week that said Ukraine's fighting tactics are endangering civilians. Now, the group said on Sunday that it is sorry for the distress that releasing the report caused, but they said that they fully stand behind their findings. They've come under a ton of criticism from Ukrainian officials and their Western supporters. Amnesty said, quote, Amnesty International deeply regrets the distress and anger that our press release on the Ukrainian military's fighting tactics has caused. Amnesty International's priority in this and in any conflict is ensuring that civilians are protected. Indeed, this was our sole objective when releasing this latest piece of research. While we fully stand by our findings, we regret the pain it caused, end quote. So they fully stand behind their findings is the important part of that statement. And we saw, Amnesty they've been really critical of Russia throughout this whole war. They've accused them of war crimes. They've accused them of using cluster munitions. And in this report, they said that Ukraine's fighting tactics, what they're doing is basing themselves in residential areas, including schools and hospitals. But while there's viable alternatives, it's not like they have no other choice. There's other places they could go where they wouldn't put civilians at risk. And Amnesty said that as a result of these tactics, Russian strikes targeted populated areas and killed civilians. But Amnesty, they were also critical of Russia in this release. They said that these facts do not excuse what they called Moscow's indiscriminate attacks. And again, they've been super critical of Russia, but that doesn't seem to matter to Amnesty's critics over this report. Okay, so the next one here. So we have Western countries are now concerned with Turkey's deepening ties with Russia. So Erdogan, the Turkish president, he met with Vladimir Putin on Friday, and the two leaders agreed to expand cooperation on trade and energy. And now we've seen Erdogan sort of emerge as a broker between Ukraine and Russia, while most other NATO leaders have completely abandoned the idea of diplomacy with Moscow. Now we've seen Erdogan's method has done some good. We saw the deal that the UN and Turkey brokered between Ukraine and Russia. That led to Ukrainian grain being exported out of Ukraine's Black Sea ports for the first time since Russia invaded. I read reports today that said on Sunday, four ships carrying Ukrainian grain left Ukraine, Ukrainian grain left Ukraine. So, the grain is moving as a result of Erdogan's diplomacy. And we've seen the U.S. criticize Russia all day about that grain not moving, but they didn't actually do anything to help. They all they do is criticize Russia, give Ukraine weapons. So anyway, this report from the Financial Times says that Western nations are unhappy with Turkey's growing ties with Russia because you see Erdogan and Putin pledge to increase trade cooperation, and they're saying they could potentially face sanctions for this. The U.S. has said that it could enforce secondary sanctions against countries that continue to do business with Russia, and Turkey could be a potential target. Turkey has previously been sanctioned by the U.S. for purchasing Russian S-400 surface-to-air missile systems. One Western official told Financial Times that countries could act against Turkey by calling on Western firms to either pull out of Turkey altogether or shrink their relationship with the country, which would be huge action to take against Turkey, to take against a NATO country. But other officials downplayed the idea of taking such a harsh step, but they did not rule out taking negative action against Turkey if it gets too close with Moscow. Okay, so the next one here, we saw a few days of Israeli bombing in Gaza that started on Friday. Right now, the death toll is at 44 Palestinians have been killed, including 5 children. Sunday night, a ceasefire was agreed upon that took effect at 11:30 p.m. local time in Gaza. I haven't seen any reports of airstrikes since the ceasefire went into effect, so hopefully it sticks, but we can't trust the Israeli government to keep its word. And it's very strange how this bombing campaign started. They targeted the Islamic Jihad, which is a group in Gaza that it's different than Hamas. They're not really well known. They're leaders, and they have less sophisticated weapons than Hamas, and Hamas does not have sophisticated rockets, but they're even cruder, the weapons that this group Islamic Jihad has. So we've been running stuff from the Middle East Eye about it. They have live updates, and they have reporters on the ground in Gaza, and they're very good on this issue. So the first airstrike, this next article here is from the Middle East Eye, and it explores why did Israel start this bombing campaign, and it was different than other bombing campaigns. It started with last Monday, Israel arrested an Islamic Jihad leader in the West Bank, in Jenin. And the narrative that's being spun in Israeli media is that they bombed Gaza on Friday because they thought there would be a response to this arrest. But this Middle East Eye report says that this Islamic Jihad leader had been arrested 7 times before. It's pretty common for him to get arrested. And there was no public warnings from Islamic Jihad that they were going to attack. And again, there's not really much that they could do from Gaza, but Israel bombed them anyway. And they said that they targeted an Islamic Jihad leader in airstrikes on Friday. It hit a residential building, and they did kill an Islamic Jihad leader, but it also killed a 5-year-old girl and a 23-year-old woman and 7 other Palestinian men. So 10 people were killed, including a 5-year-old child. And then there's been other strikes since. Again, the death toll is at 44. And really, I mean, why did they launch these bombings? It seems like it was Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid. It seems like he did it because there's an election coming up. That's the most logical reason. Again, this piece explores why else, because this group is pretty small and not really that well known. But they went ahead and did this anyway. It's really the only thing I could think of was why they did it, is because there's an election coming up in November. But we'll keep an eye on that, and hopefully there's not another flare up there. The last time Israel launched something similar, I mean, 44 killed in 3 days. That's a lot. Last year in May, they launched a 11-day bombing campaign, and they killed 160 people around, or maybe 150 something, including about 60 children. And after that, Israel asked the U.S. for an extra $1 billion in military aid to replenish their Iron Dome system, the missile defense system that shoots down the rockets that are fired out of Gaza. And Congress gave them that earlier this year. So who knows? Maybe Israel's going to try to get more military aid after this bombing campaign in Gaza. But we'll see. We'll keep an eye on it for you. And then the last one here, Russia announced on Friday that it conducted an airstrike against a group of U.S.-backed militants in Syria near Al Tanf, a U.S. military base located in the south of the country. So this is the second time in 2 months that we've seen Russia say they targeted a U.S.-backed group near Al Tanf, near this Al Tanf base. And they're not saying that they targeted the SDF, which is the group that the U.S. backs in eastern Syria. That's kind of on paper. The U.S. is in Syria to back the SDF against ISIS, but really their occupation of eastern Syria is more about keeping the area out of the Syrian government's hands. And it's part of the economic sanctions campaign against Syria that specifically targets the country's reconstruction. They don't want them rebuilding from the war. But these strikes targeted Liwa Shuhada El Karitain. SHQ is the abbreviation for them. So they're a group that the U.S. supported against Assad, and the Pentagon confirmed that the strikes took place, but they didn't provide any details. But this is really just an example of, this is the second time we've seen Russia launch airstrikes very close to this U.S. base. And it just kind of demonstrates how the U.S. presence in Syria acts as a tripwire for a war between the U.S. and Russia. We've seen U.S. and Russian troops have encounters in Syria at checkpoints and stuff like that. And it's just, there's always a risk. I mean, there's always a risk for the American troops that are getting attacked by, there's always the occasional rocket attack on U.S. bases. It's just risks so much the U.S. being there. Okay, so that's it for today. We got a lot of good viewpoints as usual. I will catch you guys tomorrow. You can contact me at news@antiwar.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at @DeCampDave, and you can message me there. I will be back tomorrow with more news. If you want to support the show, antiwar.com/donate. We're not doing our fundraiser right now, but you could always give us a donation. You could set up a monthly recurring donation. We could always use more of that. We're entirely funded by our readers, and we need all the help we can get. It's tough to be an independent media outlet, and the only way we could do it is with your support. So with that, I will leave you, and I will talk to you tomorrow.